Afternoon, family. It's awesome to be able to present today's sermon. This meeting. I am laughing a little bit because for whatever reason this just feels really awkward. I would rather be doing this live and talking to you guys. Um, Recording it seems a little awkward to me, but I love you guys, and I'm hoping that the Spirit will speak through me. Um, as we continue on with this the series of Jesus educating disciples immersively. I want to talk about what it means to be kind of immersive. Honestly, you know it's not possible to be immersed by yourself. I mean, you can't learn from other people by yourself. So I had titled my sermon "From Lone Wolf to Pack Member." And I kind of want to talk about how discipling is going to will transform our minds from a point of self-serving to selfless serving. And so, to start with my analogy of the lone wolf, lone wolves, they're out there in the woods, they're living independently. They're not part of a pack, right? They're not a member. It could have happened for various reasons, because obviously at some point they were in a pack. They were born, right? They were born in a family. They might have gotten pushed out. They might have gotten lost. Um, they may have even chosen to leave the pack at some point in time. What's interesting, though, is ultimately, in the long run, very few wolves remain living as lone wolves, and especially those who choose to leave. Um, from it, sometimes they come out of it stronger, more intelligent, but in all reality, if you look at them, they have a hard time taking care of themselves. It's hard to get food. Wolves are used to getting, large game, deer and such, which in a pack is not as big of a deal. You got a couple wolves, they surround it, and they can take it down. But a lone wolf, they're pretty much stuck with small game. They can't really fend very well for themselves. Um, as a pack, you have several wolves. They're looking out for each other. They're looking out for each other's cubs. They're sharing guard duty, and ultimately they're just looking out for the survival of their community as a whole. I mean, that is the concern. I don't want to take this metaphor any further than we need to, but we too as disciples, we need to look out for the survival, the spiritual health, the spiritual well-being of our community, our congregation, our spiritual family. That is our concern. If we look at first century town of Bethsaida, um, we had it been an American town, we probably would have called it Fishington, or I'd rather probably British, right? Fishington or Fishville. Um, it's this town that's sitting right on the Sea of Galilee, and we get a glimpse into another community who also put the whole survival as a concern of the community. And what's interesting is of all the places in the ancient world, Bethsaida, or that region, including Bethsaida, is the place where the practice of discipleship is thought to have been most prominent in that world. Um, Side note, uh, in this town, we know of five disciples by name, four of which were apostles that came from here. Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Philip. Um, what did it look like living in this community, in this discipleship-centric community? Bethsaida itself was just a small little town, few hundred people. But they, even within that small town, a few hundred people, they lived even in smaller micro communities, which they called insula. And it's called insula based on the structure they lived in, an insula, which was a living area, living space where kind of had a surrounding set of building structures that were connected, living spaces around, and then it would have been kind of done in a U shape so they could close off one end with an entrance to the area with a courtyard, a shared courtyard. If the families grew, because this is not just necessarily one family, or if it is one family, it's multiple generations, multiple siblings. But as it grew, someone got married and brought in a wife, potentially like Joseph. Well, except for Joseph didn't live in Bethsaida, but had he, then he would have been building off this structure, and then they would have extended the courtyard to include living space, so that you would walk into the courtyard and then to your living space. But most life was in that courtyard because they shared a cooking space. Oftentimes they all, if not, or most of them, shared an occupation. So, it's likely that Peter and Andrew's family cohabitated with James and John's, because it says their families were partners. They had shared responsibility for children. There's that adage, it takes a village to raise kids, right? Well, in this case, it's an insula. It took the insula to raise the kids. They had a share of worship. They had shared beliefs, for festivals. Like, when you head up to Jerusalem, they would travel to and from Jerusalem together. They would stay along the way together. What we would have seen if we looked into their insula is we would have seen them supporting one another. They would have been encouraging one another. They would have even been correcting one another. They recognized that discipling is more than just a good idea. It was necessary for their spiritual health and their growth, not only of themselves, but of their friends, of their family, and of their children. They wrapped almost every aspect of their life in this. Proverbs 27:17 talks about, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. They deliberately arranged their lives to live out this principle of sharpening one another. Central to enacting this goal of sharpening one another was to include a rabbi, a teacher of the law, within their insula. These men, they may have come from one of the children within the insula. They may have, but they would have demonstrated, an understanding of Scripture that surpassed their peers, and were granted this title of rabbi, right? They would have memorized the whole Old Testament, so they certainly had the book knowledge. They had that, but again, in these communities, they're putting it into practice. But these rabbis weren't just limited to teaching; they were also part of the community, right? They were they brought utility to that. If it was a fishing group, he probably was a fisherman too. If he was part of Jesus' group, where they were tectons, generally stonemasons or carpenters, they built things. He probably would have done that as well, or done that instead. But again, each part of this community was designed to provide for each member's spiritual well-being. Side note: at one point in time, Liz's siblings, we had actually discussed maybe buying a piece of property and having separate homes on that property, but then having some communal things such as shared out greenhouses, or like a dining halls where we could share meals and have activities. Clearly didn't go anywhere. We're here. They're still on the west side of the state. For various reasons we didn't do it. Maybe because we were worried about labeling being incurred, but whatever. But this community sounds amazing, right? They're there to help one another, build each other up, feed one another, like spiritually and physically, right? This community was put into practice the principles that Reuben really talked about as being core of discipleship last week, right? I mean, think about it. Picture this town early in the morning, really early in the morning, while it's still chilly outside. The men, they're grabbing their nets because they've been fishington, right? They head out to the boat. Someone starts singing a psalm as they go down, right? Because Scripture, that's embedded as part of their lives. It's important to them because they are disciples, and everyone starts joining in. Terrible singers, great singers, in between. But it's a joyful noise, right? And spirits, they're lifted, and everyone's encouraged. Mid-morning, sitting out in the fishing boat, things aren't going so well. Think about, Peter's like, we're not getting any fish. But, some guy's talking about how, he had an argument with, his wife last night. A couple people are chuckling because they live in an insula. Everybody heard it. But he recognizes that he sinned, and he's confessing his sin. And they thank him for being open, and then they spur him on towards changing maybe something in his character, or how he approached his wife in that situation, right? What might he be able to do to avoid that in the future? And he submits to their advice. He takes it to heart, and he thinks about it, and he prays about it. He may even ultimately, latch onto some scriptures that someone brings up. Maybe he happens to be in the boat with the Insulas rabbi, right? So the Insulas rabbi is like, he's going to start, pitching out Psalms and Proverbs, or maybe even things from, the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. And that evening, as they head back to the Insula, their children are greeting their dads as they come back, because they've been home with mom. I potentially were home with the rabbi, because maybe this is the day that the rabbi's staying home, and one of the kids is just sitting there just antsy, right? 5, 6 year olds can't wait to tell them about a Bible story that they heard, about the instruction they were receiving during the day. And while that's going on, you have a toddler running around, and he falls down, scrapes his knee pretty bad, and he's on one side of the courtyard, his parents on the other. But not to worry. Why? Because another grandmother, not his own, right? Because it's, again, multiple families together. She's nearby. She picks him up, asks him if he's okay, helps him brush himself off, maybe, kisses his knee, and sends him back playing, because that's what kids do, right? She's loving one another. She's not, it's not limited to just taking care of her own, right? And that sorrowful husband that we met on the boat, right? He heads immediately over to his wife to apologize, and she forgives him, right? The thing is that nothing in that story is truly fictional. I mean, okay, the settings, right? I made up all the little, exact details, but really I can think of many stories here in just in Tri-Cities, let alone other churches I've been part of, where someone in the church has performed these exact acts. I'm not overly concerned for my kids' welfare when we go to a park, for church service, or for Bible talk or whatever. Why? Because I know when they're running around, I'm not the only one watching them. I try not to be overly dependent upon that, but it does put my mind at ease that I've got family there that are willing to help. It's been good too, at times where we have had nurses in our group, and one of our kids is like, and so, hey, can you come look? And they do. They're looking after my kids. And there's been a couple times like, you should probably go get it, checked out. Like when Jane broke his pinky, I think it was Jeremy, said, yeah, you probably should go get it x-rayed. We did. It was broken. Got it fixed. These things happen. We're involved with one another's lives. This week, amazing as it, is, of course, because we're perfect. Liz and I had a bump, right? It wasn't anything huge. But we ended up needing help to work it out. It happened to occur right before we kind of have a weekly meeting with the Braves, and we thank them so much because, in our busy schedule, as crazy as it seems like, we're home. How can you have a busy schedule? But we are. We're cramming everything, trying to make sure we're taking care of our kids. We're teaching and whatnot. Just a lack of communication was causing some difficulties in our life. And but as discipleship really demands that we put ourselves, our desires behind us, and kind of instead serve one another, to meet God's purpose. It's like, not that we shouldn't take care of ourselves, but putting our needs before, or putting others' needs before ourselves. Excuse me. I almost, anyways, to make sure, and for me that means to make sure my family is being taken care of. It really required me to make sure that I take the time to determine what they need and plan accordingly, and to communicate that with my wife, and to be open. And this is what I'm seeing our family needs, and here's how I think it needs to be done. And for her to, in reciprocation. And really, what it boiled down to was, it was my sin. I was not communicating. I was kind of marching to the beat of my own drum. But it's not limited to, though, or even restricted to within our community. So far I've talked about just our church family, or my nuclear family here. In Matthew 28, it talks, we're commissioned. We've talked a lot about this the last couple of weeks. That Jesus, it says in starting at verse 18, Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. This week, my family's, started watching an animated version of The Pilgrim's Progress. If you're not familiar with this book, or this the Pilgrim's Progress. It's based on a book by John Bunyan. He wrote it in first published it in 1678. It's a Christian allegory. The actual full title of the book is "The Pilgrim's Progress from the World to that which is to come." And most publications today, when you buy the book or you see a movie, it's usually just the first half of the book, which in this case, the movie was just the first half. However, the second half is as good, if not better. But that's not the point. The point is that it's an allegory. And so, what's an allegory? It's kind of similar to an analogy or a metaphor, or even like a parable. But generally speaking, it's a piece of art, story, poem, picture, whatever. It's written in such a way to reveal hidden truths, but unlike other analogical type art forms, the people themselves within the story symbolize the ideas or principles being presented. So it's not they did this thing, and so from what they did and all the whole storyline, this is the principle. It's like they are the principle. How they live, how they act, how they talk embodies that principle. So, for example, in this book, the protagonist is Christian. And the story follows Christian's journey from the city of destruction, right, to celestial city, i.e. heaven. And along the way, he meets different people, again, that embody different truths or principles. There's obstinate, evangelist, legalism, helpful, worldly wise. I'm not going to name them all, but that's a few. And the idea is that as he travels towards celestial city, he takes them through all kinds of different places, like the Slough of Despondency, and over the Hill of Difficult, and through the valleys of humiliation and shadow of death. And at first, he travels alone, occasionally coming upon other servants of the king, like evangelists and helpful, who refresh and supply his current needs. But then he's off, heading down that king's highway alone until he meets a man faithful. Up to that point, he's kind of by himself because he was kind of discovering what's going on, reading the Bible, and then someone comes along, faithful, right? And then later on, he meets a guy hopeful. And it's here that you see Christian with a companion, that each person calls the other back to the king's highway at different points, and ultimately ensuring that the two will reach celestial city. Sorry if I just ruined the book. It's kind of like reading Revelation before you read the whole Bible. In the end, God wins. Hi. Hi guys, sorry about that. I stopped the recording because Bella came down and she needed a little bit of interaction. Where I was talking about the fact that Christian was on this journey and he met up with some companions, and so when he was walking along the road with faithful, they came upon a town called Vanity Fair, and one of the questions he asked is, why would the king place his highway running through this town? This town was known to provide everything you could ever want and every vile thing that was available. But at some point, he actually has this revelation that they're there. That highway runs through there, so that they might have an opportunity to spread the news about the king, most of which in the town had never heard of. And ultimately, through their witness, some people are persuaded to follow the king. So that was their witness, And so, I've put myself out there, and at times, and what I'll say is, I have a hard time sharing my faith. It's okay with people I know, all right, that I'm friends with because they know me per se. But I really have a problem with kind of two forms of evangelism. It's really that cold sharing and with my coworkers. I'd love to blame the former on me being an introvert, except God made me an introvert and gave me the commission, so that probably is not going to fly. Thankfully, God has grace on me, and gave me a wife that spurs me on in this area. We're out and about, and she's like, that's probably someone you should reach out to. Or yeah, so it's good. I just find it awkward. Plus, At one point, I reached out to someone and they told me I was doing it wrong. It was kind of an awkward conversation, but they said that I need to work on my elevator speech. So, yeah, probably do. The latter is probably more familiar to most people in the sense that with my coworkers, I want to look good in my coworkers' eyes. I don't want there to be awkward moments at work. I also sometimes feel like I've made mistakes at work. I've not been the best Christian example. I don't necessarily always look like the good Christian as they expect it. But one of the things that I've had to grow in is recognizing why I do it. And I think about a week ago, I was watching a YouTube video of a man, General James Mattis. He was giving a keynote address for the Mission Support Alliance Veterans Luncheon earlier this year in Richland. I think it was in Richland. But he wasn't discussing discipleship at all in the least. But he re-sparked kind of a flame of evangelism for evangelism in me. A reason, kind of like the drive. So if you guys don't know who James Mattis is, he actually graduated from Richland High School. His father had moved him and his family here to work on the Manhattan Project. While he was in the Army, he earned the moniker Chaos from his troops. It was kind of actually a dig. It was a negative thing. It was Colonel has an outstanding solution, which really got him thinking that he needed to start listening to his troops. He may have a great idea, but he should talk to his troops. And then oftentimes they may even have a better idea. Not always, whatnot. But he addressed an issue that I know I certainly as a vet have problems with. I don't know if other veterans listening to this have this issue, but how do you answer someone that comes up to you and says thank you for your service? What's the right way to answer? Do you say you're welcome? Do you thank them for thanking you? Do you just blow it off, say no big deal? I know sometimes, I'm like, I only served for 4 years. It's not that big of a deal. I didn't do all that much. But one time, a Marine corporal, and he had said he'd only been in the Marines for a little less time than I was actually in at that point in time. He said, he told the general the best answer that he had ever heard, and honestly, it's the best answer I've ever heard, and it's, you are worth it. You're worth it. That's an amazing principle right there. It's like, I put myself out there because you're worth it. In Matthew 18, we get to see the story, one of the versions of the story of the lost sheep. And it says, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others on the hills and go out to search for that one lost sheep? And if he finds it, I tell you, he will rejoice over it more than the 99 that didn't wander away. In the same way, is not my heavenly Father, it is not my heavenly Father's will that even one of these little ones should perish. So here we have to recognize that the Jews view themselves as the flock and God is the shepherd, right? So they would see this as kind of an analogy for themselves. So when the teacher says that one of the sheep was lost, it's like it's one of them, right? One of them had lost their way, and God left the flock, the whole, to go find them. Why? Because they're worth it, right? Many of the people in Tri-Cities are nowhere near God, but he loves them all the same. And he wishes that they would join his flock, right? They are lost sheep. They may not view themselves even as part of the flock, but God does. And so hearing that, for whatever reason, when I heard that, my heart was slowly starting to change and say, okay, when I'm reaching out, I need to be doing it because I recognize that they are worth it. They may not know it. They may not even feel it, but God does, and so should we, right? What's interesting is that until recently, I kind of believed that Matthew's and Luke's telling of this parable were one and the same. But listening to a Hebrew scholar, he kind of pointed out something interesting, that they seem to be a little different, and it seems definitive to kind of point to a different principle of discipleship. If you read in Luke 15, verses 3 through 7, it says, well, we'll start in verse 3 and 4, and we'll read more later, but it says, Jesus told them this parable: suppose one of you has 100 sheep. So one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? Remember I said before that, the Jews kind of viewed themselves as sheep in God's flock, but here Jesus is saying that the shepherd lost the sheep. So not talking about God, right? Because how could God lose a sheep? He couldn't, right? That's not the case. So, but in Jewish culture, there's also this idea, this concept of within discipleship that we still use, that there are, quote, like under shepherds, those that God has appointed to shepherd his flock, to watch over his flock. So we can find examples of where it talks about God led through Moses and Aaron into the desert. Or in the desert, like a flock. And so there, Aaron and Moses are being shepherds. David also, I believe in the Psalms, talks about, I am God's shepherd, that he has a people as the king he is shepherding, right? So here we get to see the difference also, that it's not in the center of a bunch of other parables, but rather this parable is kind of in response to Pharisees and teachers, and I'll kind of use the word pastor for a reason, that they're asking, why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? Well, Jesus is likely pointing out to them that, they're being lax in their shepherding and the leading a flock. The word pastor, I used it on purpose because it literally means shepherd. That's why the church adopted that term. Jesus kind of calls these people and says, you seem to despise these people, but these are the lost sheep of Israel. These are the lost sheep that need a shepherd. He's literally saying to them, why aren't you out finding God's sheep? And that to me is super convicting. Because ultimately what you see in the story as Jesus goes on, continuing on in the second half of verse 4, he says, when the shepherd realizes that he's lost the sheep, he says, doesn't he leave the 99 in the country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulder and goes home. He then calls his friends and neighbors together. Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over the 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Last thing I'll say about kind of this flock of 99 is that, he leaves the 99. It's like, and they stay contiguous, right? Like that means they're dedicated, right? They had to have already been dedicated. It says the righteous, right? So you're not just righteous by happenstance. Like there's some deliberateness to being dedicated, right? That's why we've really been focusing on ingraining fundamentals of discipleship, right? These principles, teaching us not only how to make disciples, but how to be disciples, how to continue in being disciples. In Ephesians 4, we get this. It talks about how we each have different roles within the body, and we each provide different things. Again, in that community, we're not all hands and feet, because where would the eyes be? Where would the ears be? Where would the tongue be, right? Like we each have our kind of different roles. But the idea is that with all these different roles, in verse 12 of Ephesians 4, it says, all these roles are here so that the people may be equipped for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So we make this commitment, this effort in service to one another. We are not living as lone wolves, just meandering through life on our own, right? But instead, with our sights kind of focused on eternity, right? We are trying to be presented to God, and to present one another to God as perfect. And this is what Paul talks about to the Colossians. It says in chapter 1, starting in verse 27, it says, "To them God has chosen to make known among the disciples, among the Gentiles, the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. We proclaim him, admonishing and teaching everyone with all wisdom, so we may present everyone fully perfect in Christ. To this end I labor, struggling with all Christ's energy, which so powerfully works in me." Paul says he's committed to presenting the church of Colossae as perfect, right? Because why? They're chosen by God, out of his great riches, that it may be mysterious to us to even understand, but he's out there, he's proclaiming, he's teaching with wisdom. He's not using his wisdom either. He's using godly wisdom. He's taking scriptures and experiences that he has where, he tried to do it his way and it failed, and he did it God's way and it was successful, right? And we must he says he taps into Christ's energy to do so. He doesn't do it with his energy. He says, "To this end I labor, struggling with all of Christ's energy that works so powerfully within him." When we are dedicated as a community to loving one another, confessing to one another, encouraging one another, submitting to one another, forgiving one another, instructing one another, and spurring one another on, helping each other grow, we transform. We are transformed. Our life turns from being a life of living as a lone wolf where we're self-serving our own needs, and instead we become those pack members, those invaluable pack members who live a life of selfless service. We have a good night or good afternoon, and I can't wait to see you guys do some fellowship today. So I love you guys. Pray these things in your son's name. Amen. Hi guys, sorry about that. I stopped the recording because Bella came down and she needed a little bit of interaction. Where I was at, I was talking about the fact that Christian was on this journey and he met up with some companions, and so when he was walking along the road with Faithful, they came upon a town called Vanity Fair, and one of the questions he asked is, why would the king place his highway running through this town? This town was known to provide everything you could ever want and every vile thing that was available. But at some point, he actually has this revelation that they're there. That highway runs through there, so that they might have an opportunity to spread the news about the king, most of which in the town had never heard of. And ultimately, through their witness, some people are persuaded to follow the king. So that was their witness, And so, I've put myself out there, and at times, and what I'll say is, I have a hard time sharing my faith. It's okay with people I know, all right, that I'm friends with because they know me per se. But I really have a problem with kind of two forms of evangelism. It's really that cold sharing and with my coworkers. I'd love to blame the former on me being an introvert, except God made me an introvert and gave me the commission, so that probably is not going to fly. Thankfully, God has grace on me, and gave me a wife that spurs me on in this area. We're out and about, and she's like, "That's probably someone you should reach out to," or yeah, so it's good. I just find it awkward. Plus, at one point I reached out to someone and they told me I was doing it wrong. It was kind of an awkward conversation, but they said that I need to work on my elevator speech. So, probably do. The latter is probably more familiar to most people in the sense that with my coworkers, I want to look good in my coworkers' eyes. I don't want there to be awkward moments at work. I also sometimes feel like I've made mistakes at work. I've not been the best, Christian example. I don't necessarily always look like the good Christian as they expected. Um, but one of the things, that I've had to grow in is recognizing why I do it. And I think about a week ago, I was watching a YouTube video of a man, General James Mattis. He was giving a keynote address for the Mission Support Alliance Veterans Luncheon earlier this year in Richland. I think it was in Richland. But he wasn't just discussing discipleship at all in the least. But he re-sparked kind of a flame of evangelism for evangelism in me. Um, uh, a reason, kind of like the drive. Um, so if you guys don't know who James Mattis is, he actually graduated from Richland High School. His father had moved him and his family here to work on the Manhattan Project. While he was in the army, he earned the moniker Chaos from his troops. It was kind of actually a dig. It was a negative thing. It was Colonel has an outstanding solution, which really got him thinking that he needed to start listening to his troops. He may have a great idea, but he should talk to his troops. And then oftentimes they may even have a better idea. Not always, um, whatnot. But he addressed an issue that I know I certainly as a vet have problems with. I don't know if other veterans listening to this have this issue, but how do you answer someone that comes up to you and says thank you for your service? What's the right way to answer? Do you say you're welcome? Do you thank them for thanking you? Do you just blow it off, say no big deal? I know sometimes, I'm like, oh, I only served for 4 years. It's not that big of a deal. I didn't do all that much. But one time, a Marine corporal, and he had said he'd only been in the Marines for a little less time than I was actually in at that point in time. He said, he told the general the best answer that he had ever heard, and honestly, it's the best answer I've ever heard, and it's, you were worth it. You're worth it. Um, that's an amazing principle right there. It's like, I put myself out there because you're worth it. In Matthew 18, we get to see the story, one of the versions of the story of the lost sheep. It says, if a man has 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others on the hills and go out to search for that one lost sheep? And if he finds it, I tell you, he will rejoice over it more than the 99 that didn't wander away. In the same way, is not my heavenly Father, it is not my heavenly Father's will that even one of these little ones should perish. So here we have to recognize that the Jews viewed themselves as the flock and God as the shepherd, right? So they would see this as kind of an analogy for themselves. So when the teacher says that one of the sheep was lost, it's one of them, right? One of them had lost their way, and God left the flock, the whole, to go find them. Why? Because they're worth it, right? Many of the people in Tri-Cities are nowhere near God, but he loves them all the same. And he wishes that they would join his flock, right? They are lost sheep. They may not view themselves even as part of the flock, but God does. And so hearing that, for whatever reason, when I heard that, my heart was slowly starting to change and say, okay, when I'm reaching out, I need to be doing it because I recognize that they are worth it. They may not know it, they may not even feel it, but God does, and so should we, right? What's interesting is that until recently, I kind of believed that Matthew's and Luke's telling of this parable were one and the same. But listening to a Hebrew scholar, he kind of pointed out something interesting, that they seem to be a little different, and it seems definitive to kind of point to a different principle of discipleship. If you read in Luke 15, verses 3 through 7, it says, well, we'll start in verse 3 and 4, and we'll read more later, but it says, Jesus told them this parable: suppose one of you has 100 sheep. So one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? You remember I said before that, the Jews kind of viewed themselves as sheep in God's flock, but here Jesus is saying that the shepherd lost the sheep. So not talking about God, right? Because how could God lose a sheep? He couldn't, right? That's not the case. So, but in Jewish culture, there's also this idea, this concept of within discipleship that we still use, that there are, quote, like under shepherds, those that God has appointed to shepherd his flock, to watch over his flock. So we can find examples of where it talks about God led through Moses and Aaron into the desert, or in the desert, like a flock. And so there, Aaron and Moses are being shepherds. David also, I believe in the Psalms, talks about, I am God's shepherd, that he has a people as the king he is shepherding, right? So here we get to see the difference also, that it's not in the center of a bunch of other parables, but rather this parable is kind of in response to Pharisees and teachers, and I'll kind of use the word pastor for a reason, that they're asking, why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? Well, Jesus is likely pointing out to them that, they're being lax in their shepherding and the leading a flock. The word pastor, I used it on purpose because it literally means shepherd. That's why the church adopted that term. Jesus kind of calls these people and says, you seem to despise these people, but these are the lost sheep of Israel. These are the lost sheep that need a shepherd. He's literally saying to them, why aren't you out finding God's sheep? And that to me is super convicting, because ultimately what you see in the story as Jesus goes on, continuing on in the second half of verse 4, he says, when the shepherd realizes that he's lost the sheep, he says, doesn't he leave the 99 in the country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulder and goes home. He then calls his friends and neighbors together. Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over the 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Last thing I'll say about kind of this flock of 99 is that, he leaves the 99. It's like, and they stay contiguous, right? Like that means they're dedicated, right? They had to have already been dedicated. It says the righteous, right? So you're not just righteous by happenstance. Like there's some deliberateness to being dedicated, right? That's why we've really been focusing on ingraining fundamentals of discipleship, right? These principles, teaching us not only how to make disciples, but how to be disciples, how to continue in being disciples. In Ephesians 4, we get to, it talks about how, we each have different roles within the body. We each provide different things. Again, in that community, we're not all hands and feet, because where would the eyes be? Where would the ears be? Where would the tongue be, right? Like we each have our kind of different roles. But the idea is that with all these different roles, in verse 12 of Ephesians 4, it says, all these roles are here so that the people may be equipped for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So we make this commitment, this effort in service to one another. We are not living as lone wolves, just meandering through life on our own, right? But instead, with our sights kind of focused on eternity, right? We are trying to be presented to God and to present one another to God as perfect. And this is what Paul talks about to the Colossians. It says in chapter 1, starting in verse 27, it says, "To them God has chosen to make known among the disciples, among the Gentiles, the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. We proclaim him, admonishing and teaching everyone with all wisdom, so we may present everyone fully perfect in Christ. To this end I labor, struggling with all Christ's energy, which so powerfully works in me." Paul says he's committed to presenting the church of Colossae as perfect. Right? Because why? They're chosen by God, out of his great riches, that it may be mysterious to us to even understand, but he's out there, he's proclaiming it, he's teaching with wisdom. He's not using his wisdom either. He's using godly wisdom. He's taking scriptures and experiences that he has where, he tried to do it his way and it failed, and he did it God's way and it was successful, right? And we must he says he taps into Christ's energy to do so. He doesn't do it with his energy. He says, "To this end I labor, struggling with all of Christ's energy that works so powerfully within him." When we are dedicated as a community to loving one another, confessing to one another, encouraging one another, submitting to one another, forgiving one another, instructing one another, and spurring one another on, helping each other grow, we transform. We are transformed. Our life turns from being a life of living as a lone wolf where we're self-serving our own needs, and instead we become those pack members, those invaluable pack members who live a life of selfless service. We have a good night or good afternoon, and I can't wait to see you guys do some fellowship today. So I love you guys.